Hi, Dr. Borysenko. Thanks for being on the show.
Hey Keith, it's great to see you. And Will, it's wonderful to see you too. And always a privilege to talk with you too.
Yeah, for us also, we always look forward to our conversations. We always have great conversations.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, this show is obviously we talked to you about. This is going to be a bit about COVID and the existential experience and threat we're all facing, and facing mortality in a different way and relationship, and all these kinds of topics that people are dealing with right now. Uh, I always think it's great though to start with something a little um, broader about you, and hearing about, you've been involved in the mind body integrative medicine sort of spiritual conversation space, uh, as long as it's really been popular in modern times, for decades now. And maybe just say, for 5 minutes, just a little bit about your story that really took you down this path. Well, why don't we start
Sure,
there?
sure. I'd be happy to. And my signature story that I always tell is just as a 10-year-old having developed a very serious mental illness, and in the briefest um, way, I became psychotic. It was kicked off by seeing a frightening film, and I was hallucinating headhunters and things from the jungle. It had been a film set in the jungle. And within a few weeks of that, I developed OCD, which is a great way to organize anxiety, I must say. You can count on your nervous system to do what it has to in order to survive. And the OCD was so overwhelming. I had so many rituals to do of a whole variety of things, from reading upside down and backwards to hand washing to mouth scraping to all kinds of things. And it was impossible. I was taken to the best psychiatrists in Boston, but this was a very long time ago. There was nothing available. There was no Klonopin, there was no Prozac, there was no cognitive behavior therapy, there was nothing. And it looked like, to my parents, like I was lost, as I was living in a state of terrible terror. When one day I sat and I went in the summers to a wonderful camp, which was a Jewish girls' camp. And I loved the feeling of being there, of being in the pine grove in nature with the lake and hearing, for the Sabbath services, the old traditional Hebrew melodies. It just like brought me into a whole other world of peace and safety. So, about 6 months into the illness, um, I decided I was going to sit and meditate and pray. One word, help. If there's anything there that listens, help. And then I began to think about the camp, and I was simply transported. It was like being in another level. The terror completely dissipated. There was this amazing, amazing sense, not only of peace, but of knowing and of intuition. And my intuition was that it was possible to recover from the illness. And I I actually immediately a kind of plan formed in my head. I was sitting there and I started to get this sense of a poem forming and that I should write it down. It was a poem about human life. It was a poem about light. And I wrote it down and it was so potent. I knew right away. I said, if I'm frightened and I just say the poem, maybe it will take away the fear. And that's exactly what happened. Within 3 or 4 days of just repeating this poem that connected me to something larger, um, my bad dreams went away, the hallucinations went away. I went back to school, I went back to camp, And this was in the fifth grade. And this has informed my entire life because I was interested what can go on in the spiritual life of people. Like, what was that? Why don't people talk about this? And I thought, they didn't tell me in Hebrew school that this other state was available. And I thought, I can't be the only one who's ever had an experience like this. There must be others. So, in whatever way you can when you're 10 years old and there's no internet, I scoured the school library and the encyclopedias looking for these kinds of experiences. And that was my entree to spirituality. But I was also I've been fascinated by the natural world since I was a child, and by, by the body, by the brain. We were actually studying the brain in fifth grade when this started. So I became really fascinated by two things. That was, how do we construct reality anyhow through the brain? Is how do we step down that larger reality into what we see and feel and hear now? And so then I think, like a lot of kids who were ill, I had been in a terrible state of terror, and I wanted to be able to help other people who
Mhm.
were mentally ill or terrified. And so I ended up with this three-part interest in spirituality, biology, and psychology. And here we are now, roughly 55 years later, after that experience. And I ended up with a doctorate from Harvard Medical School. Initially, I was a cancer cell biologist, then retrained as a psychologist, and started one of the first mind body clinics with Herbert Benson, who had brought meditation to medicine. So there you have it.
It's a great story. And, I think to kick off the conversation, because you're in such an interesting position of everything you've studied and learned and focused on in your life, and we're talking about COVID today, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on how do we make meaning out of such a massive pandemic illness. How do we make meaning out of illness that is across the globe? And what is a healthy way to tell the story? You said something really interesting, which is, in Hebrew school, this wasn't told to you, certain things are told to you. It just reminded me of what was told to me a lot in Hebrew schools about the Holocaust, and that actually formed a lot of my identity for my life
Yes.
that I had to work through. So I'm just wondering about hearing from you as we kick off the conversation. How do we go about telling this story now and into the future about this pandemic in a way that is healing and not destructive to people?
That's really a great question, Keith, because when people obviously face illness, particularly illness that, has an existential component, you can die from this. Friends, family can die from this. And it brings you face to face with impermanence. You have to make meaning out of it in order to survive. When I think somebody once asked me, "What's the soul?" And my response was, "It's the organ that secretes meaning." And
Yeah.
this is what human beings do. And we make meaning of everything. When things get difficult, for example, what you will see is that fundamentalism of all kinds increases worldwide because impermanence is too hard for people to grapple with. We want some sort of certainty, and we will all look for certainty in our own ways. And I think particularly for um, for people who may have been very, very traumatized, but by their life in general, by childhood things. Um, there's been some studies of this. You have a larger preponderance of people who will seek meaning in some kind of fundamentalist belief. And the unfortunate part is that many of the meaning stories will really not be good. Like I remember during the AIDS epidemic, I was running a mind body clinic and fascinated by the meaning people gave to this terrible epidemic. And the worst meaning is God is punishing me for my sins. And it's a terrible meaning because the natural corollary of it is when I die, I'll go and burn in hell forever. And that, of course, does not lead to good mental health outcomes for sure. I mean, that's so terrifying. It's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. So when we look at meaning, I think we need to kind of look at a spectrum, that being the far end of the negative spectrum of meaning. In the more positive spectrum, I think about the large literature on stress hardiness and what stress hardy people will tell themselves in the face of catastrophe is, yep, this is a terrible thing to be happening, but it's challenge and I can meet the challenge. Whatever is necessary, I have it within me. And that's a story that's a very positive one because it bypasses any kind of religious beliefs. And the agency is there inside. So that I think of that as that's great neutral meaning territory. Then you have people who are kind of, more they have a larger perspective that includes both their own internal sense of agency and it includes things like, well, what does this mean really for the community that I'm in? And there's a whole level of meaning to this of people who just look for silver linings, like, hey, this pandemic is revealing a lot of the bad cracks in the infrastructure of our humanity and the infrastructure of our cities and the infrastructure of our political systems, et cetera, et cetera. And while this is terrible, in the long run, we couldn't keep going the way that we were going. We needed a big shakeup so that we could see the fault lines and do something about them. And what happens with, a lot of people who think that way also become activists. So they also have agency, not only the agency of I can do something for me, but I can do something for the whole community. And then, of course, you have the whole levels, so many levels of what's the spiritual meaning of this. And I'm sure that you, like I, have listened to many people's very beautiful levels of meaning that they give to this. That kind of meaning. I mean, for me, I'm thinking, well, um, at a very personal level, it's I understand the idea of impermanence. Everything comes, it's born, it functions, it passes away. And it's one thing, of course, to know that intellectually. And it's an entirely different thing when what's passing away is you or people you love or your means of making a living or anything like that. But that spiritual point of view of simply becoming um, more comfortable with uncertainty and impermanence is is also, uh, I think, a spiritual point of view. In times like this, I always pull out Pema Chodron's book. For those listeners who may not know her work, she's a Tibetan Buddhist nun and a beautiful writer and thinker. She has a book called Comfortable with Uncertainty. and it's 108 kind of very small entries. It's a small book, and maybe they're a page or a page and a half, because, as you know, if we're frightened, the prefrontal cortex, where we're going to make sense of those things, is out to lunch. And in a fearful state, it's hard to read, it's hard to make sense of things. So I love her book. I've given it to clients for years because it's short. You can like pick it up anywhere, and there's always something that will resonate when you read it. Then, of course, there are all kinds of other wonderful spiritual meanings where people, uh, people spin the meanings according to who they are. And one big meaning is like, hey, planet Earth was ready for a wake-up call. There's been too much of warfare. There's been too much inequality. And like, this is God or the universe or the whatever you call it, hitting the reset button. And, there's that. There was a line in a poem by the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore that I like to say to myself. And the line is, the pain, oh master, the pain was so great when you were like tuning my strings, to think of myself as a musical instrument and God is tuning the strings. There's so many levels of meaning. And right away, by the way that we construct meaning, we can tell a lot just about something called attributional theory, and whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. Attributional theory essentially looks at what, when something happens, we all attribute meaning to it. And is your meaning something that is growth inducing, or does your meaning involve blame of yourself, blame of others, or a sense of helplessness and hopelessness? And I'll say the good part of this is we know at least a little bit about helping people to become more optimistic. So that was a long rant. Long answer to a short question.
It was a good answer. Thanks for that. I'm gonna pass the mic to Will. I know he's burning with some questions.
We could go in so many different directions here. Really appreciating your words about sort of resilience, and takes me into thoughts about post-traumatic growth and
Yes.
the different ways that the brain shifts with blood flow, and how I like to kind of track myself in regards to this fundamentalism that you were talking about, that, going into black and white thinking, and
Yes.
knowing that when that's happening for me, my amygdala is on fire and my frontal lobes are very quiet.
Oh, yes.
And it takes me also into the question about this way that part of what we're doing right now is social regulation through technology, and the issue of physical distancing. And I'm curious your thoughts about the opportunity that is actually here in this.
Yep. It's such a time, Will, of both peril and possibility. And social distancing offers both. And let me speak a word about the peril in terms of connection, and then the possibility also in terms of connection, even in quote, social isolation or distancing. I'd say that the hardest thing about social distancing comes from people who are living by themselves. That's the most vulnerable population, particularly people living by themselves who don't have a pet. because that means they're touch deprived. And touch, essentially, we co regulate each other's nervous system, in part by tone of voice, the look on the face, what the mirror neurons do. We project a feeling of being safe or unsafe that makes other people feel safe or unsafe. That part we can get via Zoom, or some other platform where we see one another, but we can't get touch. And the the sense of touch is so important. You two probably are aware there's a whole spate of experiments where, for example, they sent people into a library, and the librarian, when giving them a book, would either like touch 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 them like in passing, nothing that you'd even notice. Most of the people didn't even notice they'd been touched, but those who had been touched reported a much better experience at the library than those who had not been touched, even if it was subliminal. And then there were studies like when the waitress brought a bill in a restaurant, or the waiter, um, they were like allies in psychological experiments. And again, if you were brushed in some way by them, if it was touched, you left a bigger tip.
Wow.
And never underestimate the effects of touch. Think about premature babies,
Mhm.
and or failure to thrive in babies who are neglected. We have to have touch in order for our nervous system to mature, and it's the main way in which we help each other co-regulate. It's a frightening world. It's a scary world. We Everybody naturally has some degree of anxiety because we all have that built-in negativity bias that helps us survive. But once you ramp up that negativity bias into a fear with COVID, you need touch more than ever. And that's why we were talking together before it started and just mentioning that there is not a puppy available in the whole United States of America, because people need to relate. They need to touch. So that being said, the good part, which I have heard from numerous friends and clients, the good part of social distancing is that at least some subset of the population is communicating more than ever with friends and family. We're certainly finding that. I see my grandchildren live at a distance, all of them. One of them is in Costa Rica, and I find myself now reading bedtime stories to this little one in Costa Rica, and it's been wonderful from that point of view. It's like we have to, like, somebody will say, "Hey, let's have Zoom cocktail hour." And we'll have to say, "Well, we must consult our schedules." you know. And of course, that part of connectedness is really wonderful. It's actually increased. And I think we're all wondering, once we're kind of all released from our lockdown and feel comfortable going out, to what extent will that kind of connection remain, as something we keep, or will people go back to usual? This we don't know. But I think we've learned a lot about the power and importance of social connection during these times, and human ingenuity is fantastic. Right away, people
Mm.
think of all kinds of different ways to connect, to have birthday parties, to have conferences, to do all those things we would have thought you could never do unless you were in person.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering about taking this conversation now to something you started on, which is about the existential threat.
Mm.
And I'm really curious about your thoughts on what happens to the human psyche often. I mean, obviously, a lot of things it's very personal, but on more of a collective level, when we have global wars or we have global pandemics, things that threaten humanity on a more global level, what starts happening? What do you perceive starts happening in more of the collective psyche that people have to face, and maybe some
Yeah.
tips on how to relate to that?
Well, I have to say, probably if I had been in Rome or northern Italy during this pandemic, I would have something different to say because there, the existential threat was so absolutely great. As great as it was in New York City, and this would apply to people there too in the epicenter. It's very different from those of us, for example, in countries where there's not much virus. Or I live in New Mexico. There's very little, very few cases in our state. So I'm going to say it's very different depending on who you are and where you are in this pandemic. But right at the epicenter, it makes me think, um, again, saying there's a range of response. The good part about facing a pandemic together, um, which unfortunately we have not seen in this country, the good part can be that people who are on different sides, politically, religiously, economically, racially, suddenly all come together to face a common threat. I mean, there was that um, um, really difficult but elegant experiment in psychology. I think it was Zimbardo who did this, who set up a color war at a camp. And camps have color wars anyhow, but it got so out of hand that you had campers, they weren't talking to each other. I mean, it was horrifying. And so they staged a an emergency. They tipped over a water tanker and said the camp now has no water. The truck has, gone over. And unless we all get together and right that water truck, we're not going to have any water. And so that's what happened. Um, all the campers had to get together, and it brought them together. Not all of them, by the way. There were some who were still pretty testy, but largely meeting a disaster together brings people together because it erases all those lines. I like to quote a book title from a book that came out during the AIDS epidemic. I don't remember the author, but the title was No Time for Nonsense. And I think that's a good way to look at it. It's like, forget it. All this other stuff is meaningless. We've got to work together. I used to think it might be a good thing if invaders from Mars actually landed and the entire Earth had to get together and do something about that. Maybe it would bring us all together. Then there have been theories for years that maybe something would happen and suddenly the whole planet would have some equivalent of a near death experience, and there would be a sudden change of consciousness in the whole. Uh, and none of that is actually happening. And what I'm sorry to say is, at least in many places, it's just caused more divisiveness, particularly in this country, because we do not have a unified approach to dealing with the virus. There's definitely been a partisan split, and that's not helpful. as I said, I wasn't in Italy. I don't know how it was, but um, I, I'm nursing some hope that it may be a little less partisan, but I don't know. But I will say this: thank God this virus turned out not to be as lethal as something like SARS. SARS had a death rate of 10%. That would have been quite different because thanks to social distancing, I think we've been able to really flatten the curve in a very good way. And that's excellent. And of course, now the concern is people are thinking, oh, not a big problem. But, for many people, it is a very big problem. There are still many people who are dying, who may die, and many, many people who are grieving.
Yeah. And in regards to the grieving within the continued impact of social distancing, how would you, I'm just thinking about people I know who have lost loved ones during this time and who haven't been able to travel to or even have a funeral. I'm
Yes.
wondering, what would you say to folks who have lost loved ones during this time where maybe ritual that we would ordinarily have to try to move the grief is unavailable to us, at least at the moment?
Well, first of all, for all of those people, my heart goes out to them as yours does. Who ever thought that we would be unable to be with loved ones who were dying because we weren't let into the hospital? Um, this this makes grief incredibly complicated. Uh, and as you said, our usual rituals for dealing with grief. You can't have a wake. You can't have the celebrations of people's lives, which involve a lot of touching, a lot of hugging, a lot of visiting, a lot of food. I think about the Jewish mourning rituals that go on for 11 months actually after the death, and they begin with sitting shiva for a week where people are coming. There are special prayers, food is brought, uh, mirrors are covered, and there's something to it. You feel at one with all the people who've ever lost a loved one, and you're comforted, co-regulated, fed, nurtured, cried with. This is so difficult for people. So there, you know, there have to be some sort of rituals. Even a Zoom ritual is some help. Um, the first Zoom call after we were all locked down that I had was for the birthday of a physician friend of ours. And his wife had gotten together her family, many of whom are in Israel, his family from the United States, for a regular birthday situation. You never would have had all of that family. And we went around the group. There must have been maybe 25 people. And everybody had a chance to tell a story about why they loved Bruce, the birthday boy. And we all said, my God, that was like going to a memorial service before you're dead. We should all do this, we should hear about people's love, what they see in us, why they admire us, what we mean to them. So I think it's very important, at least, to have that kind of a ritual, which could happen over Zoom. And for people, I mean, grief is so difficult. I cannot imagine somebody who lives alone and is grieving a loved one, especially somebody that they could not see in the hospital as they were dying. This is, I think there's going to be, and already is, a tremendous amount of PTSD in people who have lost loved ones that we all really need to recognize, and then together as a community, I would hope, find very specific ways to introduce rituals to help them grieve. I haven't, had that come up with a client yet, but many times in the past, just helping people grieve. That there is fortunately, there are some good resources about that. But I have found that, as you said, well, ritual is important, and just helping people create ritual, doing, imagery exercises, having belongings, doing of the deceased person pictures, um, doing writing exercises. It's a very important. But you also have now a secondary problem, and that is so many people already have got unresolved trauma issues. And when you add um, just the stress of the pandemic, let alone grief over the death of a loved one to pre-existing trauma, it's a very difficult situation.
Mhm. I'm appreciating the message that I'm hearing from you, that we can sort of draw on the traditions or the rituals that we knew, or that held us
Mhm.
before COVID. But this might be a time where we really need to bring creativity to adapt, or maybe even invent rituals, new rituals for
Yes,
ourselves and our loved ones, to make sense of the grief.
absolutely.
Mhm.
Such a difficult time, such a tender time for people. And I don't want people to underestimate the fact that 100,000 people, as of the time of this podcast, have died. That's a lot of people. And it's going to be even more people during this difficult time. So we will. It's an opportunity, Will,
Mhm.
to think about what what can we do here, and it will help people if we can come up with some new new grief rituals. It will help anybody who's grieving. So maybe we can, that's a great opportunity. Now I have to go think about this.
Yeah, the opportunity, that's what I've really been focusing on. What is the opportunity right
Yeah.
now? And you and Will were talking about trauma related to the loss and the stress, and I'm really curious about the opportunity of reframing the conversation around trauma right now, and how there's so much stigmatization still about this word, and PTSD and trauma, and it seems like trauma is a part of life. And I like to sort of frame it as it's really the more significant experiences we've had that we weren't able to process, essentially. And we have these unprocessed experiences that we're still now challenged by with COVID, which is a lot of us are healthcare workers and people who are losing people, or having experiences that they're not able to process in the moment. And it can create this term we call trauma, where there's we could frame it as a dissociation from the moment, or however we frame it. But I'm really curious about how do we reframe this whole word and concept that, in my mind, it can lead to something beautiful if we have the right framework on it. And just
Yeah.
curious about that conversation right now with trauma and COVID, and what's a really good framework we can offer people here?
No, I think about it in terms of just our conversation about social distancing, and it's about connection. And I think about, okay, what is a good definition of mental health? Well, it's about having a good connection with yourself. It's about being able to give and receive and have a loving, kind connection with others. And at a spiritual level, it's about feeling a connection with something larger than yourself, something that feels like, well, it feels wise and compassionate. I'll leave that there. So it's all about connection. And that's where spirituality and mental health come together, is we're hopefully having experiences on this planet that lead us to deeper levels of connection. And what wakes us up generally to connection are, on the one hand, things like beauty, good attachment, all of these things. But the other category of experiences that wakes us up to connection is when we lose connection. And so, as you were saying, Keith, trauma, well, can be framed as dissociation. Whatever it is, it's something that holds on to us so that we're no longer in contact with the present moment. And if we can't be present, we're not in connection with ourselves as well as we might be, or with other people, or with that larger spiritual sense of connection. And so, if you look at trauma, well, it's like, this is great. This is an invitation. This is a piece of life experience which you haven't yet integrated, which feels disconnecting. And it's an invitation to reconnect. And I think that's a frame of reference that is helpful and is true. And then you think about, my goodness, you said it very well. You have to integrate these experiences, and I've certainly appreciated Dan Siegel's work on, okay, how do we integrate the brain, the upstairs brain, as he says, the downstairs brain, the right brain, the left brain, the past, the future. And a big part of that is narrative integration. How are we telling the story of our life? Is there a different way to tell the story of your life? I mean, if you tell the story of your life and it's one trauma after another, um, you will have a very unhappy brain and feel disconnected on multiple levels. But if you look instead at, okay, is there some strength that I called on for this? What got me through to this point? And you begin to hang your story on the thread of resilience instead of the thread of deficiency. That makes all the difference. Because with our any life story, so many different threads run through it. We could all tell our stories, I don't know, in an infinite number of different ways. And what I've found very helpful clinically through the years is to help people find a positive thread. Sometimes I call it a thread of grace, that it's like, oh my, all these difficult things happened. And underneath it all was some loving instruction or impulse that we've experienced this, and it's actually brought us along further on the path of connection.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's oftentimes in my clinical work, it's probably one of the most gratifying moments in working with a person with trauma is when they begin to retell the story as the story of taking a very bitter, some version of taking a very bitter medicine
Yes.
that caused them to grow and change in ways that they would never trade.
That's
for
it.
not having the experience in the first
Yeah.
place. Yeah.
Yes, certainly, because so much of my clinical work over the years has been with people who are physically ill. That's been part of it. It's, you can't look at someone who's just got a fresh diagnosis of cancer and say, there will come a moment when you'll see that this was a gift. But as people begin to go through it, you do hear that. Well, it's like, this was bitter medicine and I would never trade it. It has made me who I am. And that I think we is inspiring to us as clinicians, that, like, wow, there's this great potential to healing. It's like, okay, the challenge has been here, and we've tried to create a safe space and help our clients with that post-traumatic growth.
Very inspiring. I feel like on some level, this conversation is supporting me to stay more in that revision of the story in my journey here. And I think that it brings up for me, as we talk about tools for people, the importance of being with each other in this dialogue about
Yeah.
story, and how do we support each other? How do we challenge each other when we feel that that's the best way to love the person in the moment?
Mhm.
Challenge that story.
Yes. I can remember, this is simply a personal story of a time that I was really in the grips of an old trauma, which had come up, and then I was sick at that time. So it reminds me, it's like, my God, here I am. I'm already vulnerable because I'm ill. And then this old trauma has been triggered. I didn't even realize, it was one of those things intellectually I knew it happened, but um, I was very cut off from the emotional part of it. And I remember a dear friend of mine saying, Joan, you keep saying things that bring you closer to the edge of a cliff. Is there anything that you could say to yourself that would bring you back a step away from the edge of that cliff? And that was a very kind way to challenge how I was thinking. And instead to say, what could you do to back off from the cliff? I've always actually kept that with me, during times when I'm frightened and my prefrontal cortex has gone out to lunch and my my amygdala is reading me the fear and panic riot act. I think, you're right at the edge, baby. What can you do to take a step back? It really is a great little mindfulness exercise.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, this makes me think about just this whole conversation of connection with people, and how so many people don't have permission in themselves or in their relationships to actually talk about life and the existential reality of life, and that conversation actually doesn't happen in many people's lives. And then we face this threat of COVID, where mortality is a little more in our face than usual, and
Yes,
they still don't have that permission
that's right.
to have the conversation. And I'm fortunate, and for whatever reason, I found my own reasons and empowerment to start that conversation very early on, probably in my childhood even. But most of the people around me weren't having that conversation. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that, of how these moments in time, like war or pandemics, where it really seems like it's asking us to have that conversation.
I think that's such a very good point, Keith. this is not a society in which that conversation happens. It's so different. You know, I'm in Santa Fe. We have a lot of people here who've come from Mexico. We have the Day of the Dead celebration, you know, right around Halloween there. And that culture is so centered on being present, being sensuous, on life, on death. Every little kid understands the reality of death. It's there not just on the Day of the Dead, but it's pervasive, the knowledge of this in the culture. It's so very interesting, the, you know, huge cultural differences. Mostly, you know, people generally speaking do not talk about death. I think about that line from the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna asks Arjuna, what's the greatest mystery of all? And I mean, sorry, Arjuna, oh yes, Krishna asked Arjuna, and then the answer to that is the fact that we will all die, but nobody actually believes it. It's like, we know that, but we don't believe it. And your point, Keith, is during a pandemic, it becomes a lot more believable. If you haven't thought of it before, you know, I'm just flashing on a personal experience. I was telling you too that our beloved poodle Milo, who was 10 and had multiple medical issues, passed away. Thank God he had a beautiful passing um, just a few days ago. And as I was sitting with my husband, there's something about the immediate reality of the death of a loved one that breaks through the complacency we have, like, oh yeah, I know everything dies, but you know, don't bother me right now because I'm eating lunch. That just breaks through that. And there was a moment of sitting there with my husband, Gordy, in our grief, where I touched deeply into the, I'd say, existential terror of death. When I thought, Milo has gone, he was here just yesterday, and you know, at some point, it's going to be you, my darling husband, who goes, or it's going to be me who goes first, and we're going to grieve that loss that our beloved is gone. And the power of that was so deep. And for a moment, the terror was really existential, of like, I knew that, but I never wanted it to come to the surface. And suddenly it comes to the surface, and then you have to process it and think, okay, everything really will pass. Everything really is impermanent. One of us will pass, and the other one will grieve, and it will be difficult. And we are resilient. We will find a way. But it's, I mean, that's the greatest terror of all, is existential terror. I mean, that's what runs our nervous system, trying to avoid that terror. And when you're really bonded with another human being or with an animal, the existential terror of death extends to their death as well. And I think that our whole nervous system is configured to avoid falling into that existential terror, because I mean, even for a moment, it's so deep. So we have a lot of defenses, and one of them, Keith, is not talking about it much in this culture.
Yeah, thank you. Why don't you take it, Will?
Well, as you were talking, Joni, about not talking about existential threat, I started thinking about how our nervous system automates the experience of reality and each other. Right? We recently had Stan Tatkin on the show, and he was explaining how in conservation of energy, the looking for novelty that the human being experiences is expensive, and we're constantly automating what we already think we know so that we can go look for something that we don't think we know. And it's just such a weird experience to be human, and to be automating our loved ones and sort of, it's like, I feel like sometimes our physiology is designed to have us be partly present but partly not present.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another, I would say, benefit to some people of the pandemic, if you're already kind of able to notice what goes on in your mind, there are fewer distractions when you're home. Although you can make up lots of distractions, nonetheless, there's more time for self-reflection and for noticing where is my mind now? Where is it going? What are the things that I daydream about? What are the things that I fear? It's like, in a way, it's expanded meditation out of a small scale of time to, like, suddenly we're in this little meditative bubble, at least some of us, where, we can really notice, and then really notice, aha, what are my habits of mind, and how how do I come back into the moment, and what takes me out of it? And I don't think I'll ever be in the moment, even the majority of the time will. It's-
I can relate to
yes.
that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up, we have a couple more questions here. As we wrap up, because this conversation has gotten so uh, intriguingly spiritual for me. I have a question for the three of us, because I think it's a very relevant question right now for a lot of human beings, which is, what's the point of all this life experience? I'm really curious what we each have to say, because a lot of people are probably asking themselves that question right now. What is the point? What is this thing, right?
So we all
And
get a shot at this one?
we all get a shot at this.
Great.
Good, you go first.
You want me to go first? Okay. Well, this is my current, outside of it being a mystery, this is my current answer, which is, and it's been my answer for about, I don't know, a year now. So it keeps changing, and obviously it will probably for the rest of my life. My current answer is that love is having an experience of itself. And that's just all that's going on here. So that's my current answer. But very intrigued to hear what each of you have to say.
Like that.
I guess we'll let Joni go last, since he's our special guest today. I tend to think of life as a curriculum, and that I'm enrolled, and I'm learning how to love, and how to be love, and how to express love. And sometimes I'm progressing in the curriculum, and sometimes I'm being sent back to the grade before.
Yes. Well, I have to say, I concur with the both of you. And, for me, a little bit about my history. I've always said I have strange brain because I've had migraines since I was a kid, and I tend to float into different levels of things and have odd and weird and mystical experiences. And every one of those has revealed love. That for me, the whole nature of this universe is loving kindness itself, which seems so ridiculous to people. We're in the middle of a pandemic. People die. People are hungry. People suffer. It's so, so very difficult. And I do believe that in the end, it's all about love. And I do believe, although I have no no idea what becomes of us when we lay our body down, I actually do believe that our consciousness continues to evolve and that eventually we all end up in the same place, and that is, um, there's no way to express it, it's ineffable, but it has everything to do with with love and the continual evolution and spread of that love. I wish I had words for this, but I do not. And that has helped me a lot because when I look at people, and when I look at people who, my brain wants to judge, like, are you kidding? What are you doing? I'm thinking it's all part of the curriculum. This is a place of duality. There's both day and night and good and evil. And without that duality, there would not be growth, there would not be challenge. And in the end, it is all about love. And that, of course, begins with a sense of empathy, of compassion toward others, and of compassion toward ourselves. That's so very, very important. I think the curriculum largely is about kindness. I always come back to this one story of the famous historian of religion, Houston Smith, who died, I think, just in this last year. And he was squiring Aldous Huxley around MIT, where Huxley had shown up to give a talk. This is one of my favorite stories. And he had a chance to ask, as a young man, he's asking the famous Aldous Huxley, what's it all about? What have you learned in your whole long life exploring states of consciousness? What can I take away from this? And Huxley turned to him and he said, be a little kinder.
Oh,
This-
Yeah.
I love that.
beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you for entertaining that. Be a little kinder is a good way to go. How can people learn from you? Any programs they should be aware of right now? How
Um,
should they connect with you?
Thanks. Yes, you can go to my website, and there's only one little kicker there. You have to know how to spell my name. But I think you guys have it on the course
Yes.
material,
Yeah.
joanborysenko.com, or come and join my Facebook community page. And also, what what I have going right now is a program that it's kind of my legacy program that I've developed with a wonderful colleague of mine. It's called Graceful 360, as in full of grace, two L's. And it's seasonal, 3 months at a time. We're just almost at the summer solstice, and the summer version is starting. And it's a wonderful program because I create a special meditation that matches the bioenergies of each month as the earth energies in nature change through the seasons. There's a meditation, then there's a positive psychology piece. We install one of the 24 character strengths each month, and we call these the graces. It's like this month's grace is loving kindness. And so there are practices around that. There's a monthly ritual. I've always thought ritual is a very important way of connecting us to what is really important, emergent, as we've just talked about grief ritual. There's also a recipe every month that goes with the bioenergies, an herbal remedy that comes. This June's is actually cider vinegar and rose petals. This is an old remedy that stops itching. So this is like a full service mind, body, spiritual herbal thing, complete with Zoom calls once a month. So that's Graceful 360. And sign up on my website and you'll get some emails about it. And then I'm always doing various programs. One of the programs that will come up probably in not for another 3 or 4 months is my online spiritual memoir program, which is what we've been talking about, looking for the thread of grace within your stories. So lots of ways to stay in touch with me. And then, well, we're thinking about a free gift that we could offer people who've seen this podcast. And I thought about lots of different things. And then I settled on a sleep kit. And I think so many people are losing sleep and asking that question. So the sleep kit is, again, it's mind, body, spirit, and a little herbal in there too. That really is very effective at helping people find the rest that we all need.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we always like to end with one question here that you've probably covered some of already, but the question is, if you had a billboard that every human being saw once in their lifetime and there was a paragraph on there, a message you could tell them, what would you say to them?
I would say probably be a little kinder and start with yourself. Be gentle with yourself. And as you feel gentle, that will be a balm that goes forward and touches everybody else.
Hey, thanks, Joni. It's always such a pleasure to connect with you. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. I just love these opportunities for us to get together and really have conversations that matter. So thank you.
Yeah.